So if I can just begin by saying thanks for coming along this evening, and I really welcome this opportunity to talk to you tonight about additional support needs in reference to Glasgow's approach. And this tonight is really about a lot of the processes and the way that we work in our schools. And I have said to Leanne that I'd be happy to look at further sessions if parents want to suggest what they might want to see more of. I'd be happy either myself to do that or members of my inclusion team, a lot of whom are colleagues in schools as well, for them to help out too. We can start the slides now, Susan, if that's okay. Thank you. That's brilliant. Thanks very much. So if we can just move on to the second slide, Susan. And apologies, folks, and thank you very much, Susan, for doing this, but Zoom's not working in my works laptop. Okay, that's great. So I just thought I would begin by giving you a wee overview of my role. So as you can see, I'm the strategic lead for inclusion, and that also means that I'm responsible for the development of nurture, for looking at classroom practice across all our schools, for staff training needs and pulling together a training plan for the city. And that also includes looking at training for parents and carers, which is an area that we're trying to get more involved in. And I'm also the link manager. We have 21 standalone ASL schools and 35 co-located bases. So that's bases that are within mainstream schools. I also link closely with the Health and Social Care Partnership. So that is particularly social work colleagues who are then in charge of speech and language, CAMHS, etc. in Glasgow. And I also link with other authorities. We have a number of our children, Glasgow children, who can be looked after in other authorities, and I link with those other councils around that. And something I'll talk a wee bit about later on, I'm also responsible for the virtual school and also link manager for Glasgow Psychological Services. So a fairly busy job. And I guess would also want to say too that I have spent the vast majority of my teaching career in Glasgow. I started in the Gorbals, and then I moved to Smithycroft in the northeast of the city before moving over to the south to Hill Park Secondary, and then moved back to be a head teacher for 10 years in Smithycroft in the northeast. So not an ASL school, but a school which I think has a really proud reputation in terms of inclusive practices as well too. And I'm now working in headquarters. I started there 2.5 years ago, and about 5-6 months into my job, the pandemic started. So it's been a very steep learning curve, but one that I absolutely relish and enjoy. My next slide is actually a wee video, and it was a video that was made in 2019, in August 2019, and it was to show the various provisions that Glasgow had and what Glasgow was trying to do in terms of additional supporting children and families who are children with additional support needs. But I still feel that a lot of what is in this is relevant, and I will update some parts of it, but I think it's important to get that kind of overall picture of what it is we're trying to achieve. So,
everything that we do is guided by our aspiration to be a nurturing city.
So now,
this includes challenging our views of what helps children and communities to flourish, and understanding barriers to learning. This can include poverty, disadvantage, social exclusion, and additional learning needs. Our vision. We've embarked on a journey of improvement to make sure that any child or young person in Glasgow with additional needs will receive the very best education to help them be the best they can be. We want as many of our children and young people to be able to learn in their local communities, all our specialist provision to be flexibly matched to the needs of children and young people with additional support needs to have successful transitions, and children and young people to learn in the most inclusive environments possible to suit their needs. Mythbusters. Contrary to popular belief, we've increased specialist provision across the city, not reduced it. 10 years ago, we had 54 special schools, and all provision was recorded as being separate, even when it was co-located within a school. We had a total of 1,685 places, which was 2.6% of the total school population in Glasgow. In 2019, we now have 23 Support for Learning or ASL schools. We stopped calling them special schools many years ago, as this didn't reflect the needs of the children and young people who require the specialist provision. Children in enhanced provision co-located within a school are now included in the whole school role. We now have 1,310 places in ESL schools and an additional 744 places in co-located enhanced provision. This now equals 3% of the total school population in Glasgow. Next steps. Glasgow has increased the range of ways in which children and young people can access targeted support in small group sessions. We want to enhance our understanding of the importance of relationships, and we will use the 6 principles of nurture to guide our work. These are: children and young people's learning is understood as they develop. The classroom and school offers all our children and young people a safe place. The importance of nurture for the development of well-being. Language is understood as a vital means of communication. All behaviour is a form of communication, and we must learn to interpret all forms of behaviour. The importance of transitions in children's lives. Our journey along the road of improvement will evolve, develop and continue to make a difference in the lives of all our children and young people who need additional support to help them achieve their potential. We promise to continue to invest in professional learning for all our staff, listen to the views of parents and carers and their children, support senior staff to work together on shaping the curriculum with innovative and creative approaches to learning, teaching and assessment, work together with parents and carers to reach mutual understanding about their child's education, and, if there's conflicts, we work together to resolve them with the child at the centre of everything we do. Work with Resolve, our external partners, to provide mediation when a compromise can't be reached, and facilitate and support our young people to exercise their rights. By working in partnership, we will continue to make a difference in the lives of Glasgow's children and young people.
Thank you, Susan. I appreciate that. If we move on to the next slide, in that video there were a number of key messages, and I just want to talk a wee bit about those. The first one was about learning in local communities, and that's something that over the past few years we have been trying to move towards, and that we think is really important. It's about children being very visible in their communities, linking in with third sector. And obviously in terms of transport as well, we don't want to, unless we have to transport children and young people across the city, we want it to be more localised provision. And part of the response to that was to move away from a kind of city inclusion group support to now looking at working within areas more closely when we're making decisions. Another message in there is about flexibly matching the schools as well, and looking at the changing profile of need within our schools and how we respond to that. And I'm going to talk about that in one of the next slides. And then the part about successful transitions. And we know that that's really important to try to reassure parents and carers, but as well as that, so that the school can get a clearer understanding of the needs of the children and young people who are going to be learning with them. And it's also about things like ensuring that there's appropriate equipment, and any changes that need to be made in terms of the environment itself can be taken into account. But as I'm sure you can imagine, the pandemic has made some of that more difficult. And we're this year trying to get those transitions moving a bit quicker as well. In terms of the last point about suitable inclusive practice, we have already this session rolled out more training opportunities, and that's not just for teaching staff, that's also for our support staff colleagues. Some of that is led by practitioners themselves. Some of it is from our colleagues in psychological services, others from the inclusion team, and some of that is supported by local colleges, etc. So where we think that there is practice that our colleagues will benefit from, or where our colleagues are telling us they would like some more support, then we're trying to respond to that. And the last part of that was about flexible responses, and that's something that we're doing a lot more. So, drilling down to what are the individual needs of those children and young people. Do we have partners that we can work with that can help us as well to try to meet the needs of particular young people, so that we can take a much more flexible, bespoke approach. If we can just move to the next slide, Susan. And I mentioned in this about the changing profile of need. And I wanted to show you how things are changing. So in terms of those ESL schools, those standalone schools, We previously talked about, and you can see there, complex needs, primaries or secondaries, ALN, which is additional learning needs, SEBN, which is social emotional behavioural needs. And one all through just means it's an early years primary and secondary, and we have 3 bespoke early years complex needs provisions. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to move away, recognise that we want to be more responsive within our areas. So we are trying to move to a situation where all schools will be ASL schools, and they'll be able to meet the needs of a range of children and young people who have more complex needs. The ALN definition, in fact, is quite interesting. Glasgow is one of the few local authorities that actually have that provision. That's historical for lots of different reasons, but it is something, if you won't see it replicated, and arguably as well, some of our young people in those schools in other authorities would potentially be in mainstream bases and in provision there. And in fact, sometimes we often see historically parents who might have had children or young people at these provisions, and they're concerned about things like, going to a bigger secondary, they want a quiet environment, etc., especially if the child has an autism profile, will want them to have provision in those schools. But those schools in particular are changing quite significantly, the primaries and the secondaries, with that previous ALM, which will then become ASL. And we're moving away. There was times in these schools where there was curriculum provided to National 5 and higher, and that really isn't appropriate in an ASL setting, and should be, those young people should be benefiting from the wider richness of a secondary mainstream curriculum, but perhaps within a base within that or other provision. And we'll be looking at not really going beyond National 3 in our ASL schools and looking at a curriculum that is more about skills for life, learning and work, because that's been the message from parents as well too. You also see too that we have a large number of bases across Glasgow, language and communication resources, which are predominantly for children and young people who have an autistic additional support profile of need, additional learning needs bases where it can be a mix of children depending on their needs, inclusion bases which often support young people with social emotional behaviour needs, as does our enhanced nurture provision. Glasgow no longer has any standalone primary, what was previously SEBN primary, and that it's very important that there's a message there for children of that primary age about seeing that modelled behaviour of their peers in a primary setting, and we wanted them to have that opportunity. So enhanced nurture provision is about supporting those social emotional behavioural needs, but giving those children an opportunity to experience mainstream classrooms as well too. And then we have some quite specific bases for hearing impaired, children with hearing impairments and young people with visual impairments. And they're part of the mainstream role. And on top of that as well, Glasgow, as you know, is the largest number in Scotland of nurture classes, which again are about helping some children who are not as ready for education in those early years to help them to settle better. And then we also have a large number of support staff out supporting children for whom English is an additional language and our dyslexia support service. So, a huge wide-ranging provision. And if we can just move to the next slide. And as you can see, I just wanted to give you an overview of the amount of staff that we have in the system and the high proportion that's dedicated. And in fact, that number has increased since I last collected the figures at the census have increased that a bit as well too. Next slide, please, Susan. And this was just to give you, it was one of the things in the myth busting about how the numbers in schools, that sometimes, people say, oh, they're cutting back in numbers, and that certainly hasn't been the case in Glasgow. And you can see from that, that's about the numbers I have so far in terms of next year. So it increased this year and it's been increasing year on year just now, but it's quite significantly above even that figure in 2019. And that doesn't reflect as children who might have some additional support within their mainstream setting. and we have approved some additional support for those children and young people in those schools. But it is a significant amount of our children and young people. And within some of our schools, it's quite interesting because some of our school roles have increased quite significantly in ASL2, and we are at the stage where a number of our schools are at capacity physically in terms of that environment. So the next slide is really about what if either I as a parent or my nursery or school feel that your child needs specialist provision or more support. And when I came into this post, there had been quite a significant change. Sorry, Susan, you can just move to the next slide. And that was moving away from a previous model, which was a city inclusion group, where schools sent all the requests for placements to. And they had moved to this area model to ensure that decisions were made more locally, and the areas were obviously the south, northwest and northeast. And there was also a shift in terms of this was not all about placements or pathways, and we had lots of discussions with head teachers about what we were trying to look at was support. So you might put in a referral, the referral is for support, and within that it will then be determined whether or not it might be more appropriate to look at a pathway, or whether it might be we look at outreach support for a child, or we look at enhanced support in the school, or we link in with peers to support the school as well too. So the people who are on these area inclusion groups are head teachers, and I think that's really important. It's people on the ground who work obviously with children and young people, and they come from mainstream schools, some of whom have bases, some of whom are standalone head teachers, so from ASL schools themselves. There's also an inclusion officer linked to every area group and a deputy principal psychologist. So often when parents will get in touch with me about perhaps being unhappy with the decision of an area inclusion group, it's important to see that it is people who are there, they are in schools, and they are working very closely at the chalk face, as we often say, in and around children and young people, and are very knowledgeable as well too in terms of inclusive practices. And what happens is either the nursery or the school will collate a referral to the AIG, and we call that, it's an options appraisal. And they might also include a child's health and wellbeing plan or anything else that they feel is relevant. And they will seek the views of obviously staff who work with that child. They seek the views of children, the children if they're a bit older and they're able to give that view. And they seek the views of parents or carers as well at that stage in the process. And where there is an educational psychologist involved, they will also seek those views too, and then the referral goes to the AIG itself. Then the AIG looks at all those referrals at different times of the year, and together in groups they look at those decisions, and then those decisions are moderated by the deputy psychologist, the chair of the group, etc. So it's quite a thorough process before those decisions are actually made. And, Scotland does have a national policy of presumption for mainstream. I think when it was first introduced, virtually every child had to go to P1, and that wasn't always appropriate when moving from early years. So we do collect information and we do look at cases of children moving. But, it's such a critical time because, as you are well aware, it's a critical time in terms of the learning development of any child. And sometimes, when we make those decisions, it is what we call a strengths-based approach when we're making those decisions about what each child is capable of based on the information we have. And sometimes we have to phone back the nursery or the school to ensure that we've got as much information as possible if we don't feel that there's enough there. Because, when we're making these decisions about perhaps moving to a standalone ASL environment, but even within a base itself, particularly with children who might be autistic, that language development at this time is crucial. And sometimes to remove them from the opportunity to be in mainstream. And I know that sometimes parents might not necessarily see it as an opportunity, but it is really important because that's a language-rich environment. And so we're thinking very carefully about, are we beginning to see the early signs of a language development? And if so, we want them to be part of that language-rich environment, as well as looking at that learned behaviours from others in the classroom. And as I'm sure you appreciate, the pandemic at times has made that really difficult, since some children have not had the experience of nursery that they sometimes get from being in amongst other children as well too, in terms of that development. So it can make those decisions a wee bit more difficult. But the AIG also has that kind of holistic overview. So it has all the cases there in front, and what it has to do as well is at times prioritise that needs. We do try to make the decisions that we believe are in the best interest of any child or young person moving forward. But we know it can be very difficult if parents want a placement and then they can feel quite disappointed. But we do track children as they move on. And we do track that development as well too, but it just would not be possible for us to give places and specialist provision to everybody that would ask. And that includes the schools and the nurseries at times as well too, because, we are much more data rich. And sometimes, you might have a nursery that might put in a number of requests, and you have some that might put in very little. And what it's our job to do is really to stand a bit back from that and decide, well, it's about the individual child themselves and the information that we have, not really how many referrals each place puts in. But sometimes we do have conversations where we can see patterns of lots of referrals, and then we want to work with that provision, whether it's a school or in early years, to look at why is this? Is there more training needs in here? Is there more support that's required here to ensure that the needs of more children and young people are being met? So that's the AIG process. One of the things that I'm hoping to do over Easter, although potentially it might go to the summer, and we'll come to maybe why that's the case later, is to improve our front-facing information so that there is more information about that process. And that's actually really been informed by some parental correspondence that I had a few months back, and might even be longer than that. I don't know about you, but I'm beginning to lose a wee bit track of time just now, from a parent who sent me an email and said, I really feel that you need to have information about it. And she went through about a good 10, 15 points. And I did say to her at the time, I will keep this email, and I absolutely have. And I intend to use it as a basis for making sure that our information does improve, and I intend to do that. The next slide is really, like everything in councils, we have policy guidelines, and these policy guidelines are shared. Our main one is every child is included and supported, which links in with a lot of national policies as well too, but Glasgow has that drive for that nurturing city. I'm going to come on to that in a wee second. And although it's June 2016, and one of my other jobs when the pandemic does slow down a wee bit is reviewing the different elements of that. But obviously I use it a lot, and I have looked at it a lot over recent months as well, and a lot of what's in there is still very, very relevant to the way in which we support inclusion across Glasgow schools. And then the next slide is really important, because it is that vision about a nurturing city that we are continually striving for and want to achieve, to ensure that our families do feel that their children are welcome, nurtured and secure within their schools. And if I move to the next slide, because this is the 6 nurture principles here. And last week, I had the pleasure of speaking to a delegation of people from France, and we were talking a lot about nurture and what nurture means. And I think sometimes when people hear nurture, they think, it's all cuddly kindness, etc. And whilst I do like to think there is absolutely an element of that, it's important to say that, within each of these 6 areas, there is a lot of research, there's a lot of evidence, and there is a significant amount of training that takes place in schools, either delivered by colleagues and particularly delivered by our colleagues in Glasgow Psychological Services, so that our colleagues who work with children and young people fully understand how they can practically take forward support. I've always been a great believer over the years that theories are all very well and good, but, you know, certainly when I was always working with my colleagues, it was about how do we put these theories into practice? What does it actually look like? Schools are very much involved in that and continue to refresh that. And in fact, just now, one of our big refresh areas is with secondary schools revisiting the all behaviourist communication strategy in particular. And we've just upgraded in consultation with schools that, and that's about to be rolled out again. And just a couple of the things as well to highlight from our inclusion policy document that I wanted to highlight, because whilst I've shown you about how many ESL schools and co-located bases and that AIG provision, the majority of children who have additional support needs actually are within our mainstream schools and are being supported within our mainstream schools as well to progress in their learning. So if we can just move to that next slide, Susan. And this is just some of the key points as well from that document. And first of all, one of the main point is about that continuing professional development and increasing and expanding the skill base of staff. I know that we've all heard that phrase, every day's a school day. And for our staff, that continues to be the case. You know, it's about lifelong learning for them too. And we continue to expand our offer. We've now got it in a variety of ways in terms of, you know, webinars. We're hopefully getting back to a bit more face-to-face training as well too. We've certainly been able to do that during some in-service days, but there's lots of exchange of practice as well and peer learning from each other too. But certainly we are planning for more training moving forward. And one of the things that we've been also wanting to develop is a framework around supporting our children with autism too. Peer support, so I mentioned that, but also we were looking to expand. We were hoping to do that this session, but unfortunately the pandemic is getting in the way a bit of that, but we really want to move forward with staff from our ASL schools also supporting the practice of colleagues in mainstream. There is some of that beginning to evolve and happen, and where it has, it's been really, really positive. So we want to try to expand that. The part about resources, as you know, particularly we're thinking about the impact of digital learning. And we've had the rollout of iPads at secondary level and across much of the primary as well too, and certainly in ASL. And it's about becoming more and more aware of those apps and the way in which you can use iPads, and the way in which in our ASL world that augmentative communication resources have been used as well too. So we have some colleagues who are specifically involved in that. And a lot also of colleagues who will contact us from our ESL schools to share. There's something I found that's really, really positive. Can we look to share it amongst others? And that's really positive as well. And then that last point on it about pupils supporting other pupils. And that goes back to about, you know, being within your local community and being supported in your local community. Inclusion, we often talk about how adults behave. But it's also really important how children and young people behave and their, you know, them as role models and their values and kindness, etc. But we know that children and young people learn from each other. I often think about the days when I was sitting in certain classes. I see maths, I shouldn't say that, I might get into trouble, but you know, you would maybe be sitting and you might be a wee bit stuck and the person beside you would help you and you would make sure that you didn't get the row for the teacher. But that was a really good way of learning as well too. So it's looking at other opportunities that we can support children within classes and others helping with that. The next slide. And that's just, you know, the first one is about looking at the learning environments where necessary and using colleagues. At times, colleagues perhaps coming in from other schools to help in that process. that high expectations. I have to say it's a bit of one of my many mantras is about that. It's about always having those high expectations and aspirations for our young people. And, part of that more recently, we've just been able to deploy into some of our ESL schools, developing the young workforce, so employability officers, to help to develop those employability skills, to link in more with employers and develop those skills for life learning work. So really pleased about that and getting some really good feedback. And we're looking at how we can roll that out more across our schools. But of course, particularly when young people move to secondary school, all our secondary schools are very fixed on that, ensuring that our young people transition to a positive leavers destination, whether that's college, whether that's a job, whether that's university, and that's very much at the forefront of the work that our secondary schools do. And the importance of leadership as well. And we have a huge programme of leadership training in Glasgow, and a lot of that involves inclusive practice and a focus of inclusive practice to ensure that our head teachers in particular, but as well as our classroom teachers, but our head teachers are the role models that we would want them to be in terms of inclusive practice. I'm going to return to the flexible approach a wee bit later, but the next slide is really just to say that it is not just about us. It is about many partners that we work with, whether those the agencies such as social work and the health and care partnership, many third sector organisations that we work with too, such as Action for Children, Barnardo's, Love at Care. So it's about, where we see that an organisation or an agency can benefit our children and young people, then we want to get them involved in that very close link as well with social work in particular, to support families, particularly when they are struggling as well. And then towards the end of the inclusive part, I talked about bespoke individual needs, and I think there has been one of my colleagues came to a parents forum, I hope that's right. But the next slide just highlights one of our new developments that we will be hoping to expand, and that's Glasgow's virtual school. And Glasgow's virtual school brings together our enhanced support for care experience learners, our hospital education service and our interrupted learner service, and has a professional digital learning role as well too. And, we're learning so much from that about, particularly children who might be, and young people who might be struggling to attend school or are disengaging from school, or might have particular medical needs that makes school quite difficult for them. And what we're looking at again is that more bespoke, individual and flexible options for them. And that's a model we're beginning to think about in terms of how we support particularly our primary schools. As I said to you before, I come from a secondary background, and increasingly over many years, certainly the past 10, I would say, secondary schools have looked very closely at those bespoke options for young people, when at times we know that the kind of traditional school model just doesn't fit everybody. That one size fits all approach just isn't always appropriate. And so we try to work with maybe local community partners, training providers, etc., to see if there is a curriculum that better meets their needs. We've obviously looked at our own curriculums and moved away into areas that are quite different. For example, my own school, it was things like dance and introducing metalwork, introducing hospitality, sports leadership, etc. So beginning to think a bit differently. And so the virtual school is part of that as well too, and always looking for ways in which we can engage much more with children and young people that will hopefully transition them back to school, or look at something that might suit them better. And my last slide, trying to see my own timing here. Oh gosh, right, okay. Now, my last slide is entitled Learning from the Pandemic. And in that, you might assume that I'm saying that the pandemic is over. And of course, it's not for us. And in fact, I think just now we are having a particularly difficult time in our ESL schools. We've had a number of schools who are struggling due to staff absences, and a number of schools, particularly in the northeast, who have had to reduce days and have rotations of classes coming in because they've been unable, because of these staff absences, and unfortunately not been able to recruit people through the supply system as well too. So it's been, you know, a real challenge. And in fact, I was looking at the news earlier on today, and I noticed that some authorities have also had to close schools across different parts of Scotland. And really, we are desperately trying to avoid that, because I do not underestimate at all the difficulties that causes for parents when the school isn't open. But it's just been a really difficult time. So I'm always, you know, the variety of meetings that I sometimes am in, whether they're with colleagues in agencies, HSEP or national, etc., I do point out when people talk about recovery periods, etc., I do have to point out that the pandemic is still ongoing for us, and it is still causing particular difficulties. And in fact, I think just now is one of the most difficult times we've certainly had in terms of staffing in schools. However, it is also really important to reflect on things that have worked better, or the learning that we've had from this time. And there's certainly been a fair amount of that, and some of that has been about that digital learning and how it's enhanced their curriculum and also enhanced their communication as well, you know, particularly with parents and carers. A lot of the Seesaw and the Showbie initiatives have been fantastic, but it's also enhanced, you know, relationships between a lot of community partners and colleagues in HSCP. And then I've mentioned again that learning, and that's been great in terms of families engaged and supporting their children in their learning, and we want to continue with that as well too. And as I've mentioned also, that those more flexible approaches and some of those approaches that took place during the pandemic, and we're looking to see how we can continue those too. And then just that last point there, if people didn't realise it before, I think they certainly realise that now, the importance of good health and well-being, and that being at the centre of what we do. I think I said before, I have quite a few mantras, and one of my mantras has always been happy children learn better. So really schools ensuring that they put thinking about health and well-being at the heart of so much of what they do. And it was really positive to see lots of that during the pandemic as well. So I will stop talking now, and it's one of these, when I planned this, I'd hoped to have a wee bit more time, but as was said, you know, if there's things that I don't get a chance to answer, I will certainly link in with Leanne. And if there's any other areas you would like to have presentations on, perhaps in more specific areas around additional support needs, then I'd be happy to organise that as well too. But I think Catherine was keeping note of any questions coming through, so I'm just going to get my pen. Catherine, okay.
Get your pen at the ready, Jean. Yep, we have 3 questions, and the way I'm going to do this, I'm not going to name who's asked the questions. You know, we're very careful about not identifying people because this is recorded, so we don't want to identify parents and we don't want to identify young people. So the first question, this one was on fairly early in your presentation. So this one, language is listed as one of the 6 principles of learning. Why then does an ASL school with a high propensity of non-verbal children have 0 support from a speech and language professional? The children are being failed and the 6 principles are not being applied.
Okay, so the 6 principles are in relation to nurture. So that's not all about language itself. That's only part of it, I would say to you. But I think there's a fair point in there, obviously, about speech and language. And part of that is about the model having changed. And so the way we now work with speech and language is that our speech and language colleagues come along to ASL SIM meetings, and a SIM meeting is a staged intervention meeting. So, for example, say where a school is working with any child or young person and they feel that they need some more advice and support from speech and language therapy colleagues, they will come along to that meeting. They tend to take place about once a month, and our speech and language colleague will be there and they will give the school advice and support. And if the school then feels that they need more enhanced support, then they raise that with speech and language therapists as well too. I've certainly not had anything myself that's come through from the schools that is necessarily an issue. But, you know, I would be happy as well, Catherine, if the person says to you, where the school was, I would be happy to look into that and take that forward as well to see. But I would just say to you as well that a lot of our staff in ASL schools are also very much trained in how they can support that language development and that language acquisition as well too. But as I say, I would be happy to take, if you got that detail, so not necessarily the name of the child, but maybe the school, and I could have a conversation with the head teacher about that.
Okay, I think that, the next question I'm going to ask is maybe related to that, and it's about what is the best way to make contact, because somebody here saying how could they contact either yourself or another appropriate employee, because, the parents saying that they need help and they're not really getting anywhere with it. So is the best way to come in through Leanne, or is it to email you, Jean? Happy to be advised by yourself or by Susan what the best method here is for anybody that wants something answered offline after the event.
Yeah, to be honest, the best way to do it is actually, if you look at the City Council online website, there's a customer services department in that. And in fact, if anyone emails anything to them, that will automatically come to one of our officers. Sometimes they come to me, but it will come to somebody in the inclusion team, or it might come to one of them quality improvement officers to take forward as well. So it would come in the form of a complaint as well, and it absolutely would be taken forward. There is no complaint that doesn't come into the service that's logged in that way. That doesn't happen to. Sometimes things come directly to me, and what I often do is I actually send it to customer business services whilst responding as well. But it's important to do that because it means then that that complaint's tracked, and that's a sign, that it has been taken forward. But anytime a parent would send something in, it's really important that it is looked at, because I do understand at times parents can sometimes feel it's difficult. They might have a good relationship with the school, but they still might not be happy with something, but they find it, it might be difficult to take something forward when they have a good relationship. So it's fine then to get in touch and to say, look, I'd like this to be done. And I find that that's the best way to do it. And I would say to you as well that I'm a parent myself. I'm no longer in Glasgow, but I wouldn't say what council I'm a parent for. And I've used that facility at times to raise any issues or concerns that I might have. And I've certainly advised friends as well that that's always the best way to do it, because then what you've asked is being tracked.
Yeah, I would agree that, you get and there's time scales for us responding to those things, and it just means it's on the proper system. Because, inquiries can come into a whole load of different places and things can get lost. They never get lost in that system.
Never.
So going on to that part of the website is a really good way to do it. So
I was just going to say that in particularly now with my emails, I'm averaging just now about 150 emails a day. So mainly around a lot of the issues that we're having in schools just now with staffing. So that is the best way for it, as you say, to be logged and for it to be tracked.
Yeah. Okay, we've got something here about AIG process next. So in terms of the AIG process, I feel that parents could have more input. It would also be really beneficial for parents to receive feedback on how the decision was made by the group, rather than just receiving a letter saying what school your child will attend. This would be useful, especially when parents don't have a lot of knowledge about the school that has been identified as the best match for your child.
Yeah, can I say to you, I agree with you on that. As I said, when I took over, and we took over this new system, and I do think it is the right thing to have this area model for lots of different reasons. I think it's right. I think it sounds, 2 years in, early days, but we've had a pandemic in between, and that did cause issues in terms of our processes with a lot of the people who would process a lot of the admin elements of that and link in with the schools, etc., not being here, working from home, etc., not myself personally, but all of that going on. And we were actually intending to have an activity just this week, which was a feedback activity from people involved in the AIG. And then the next stage we wanted to look at was a feedback activity with parents and carers as well too. And unfortunately, due to COVID absences, we've had to cancel that. But I absolutely intend to revisit that next term. And I think it'd be really good for us to look at a forum where there were parents who were not as happy with the decision, as well as those who might have been happier, but as that this parent has said, still would like to know more about what is happening in terms of transition. So I think those are fair points, and I will keep that as well, Catherine, too. As I mentioned, I think our front-facing information has to get better as well, and we have to do that. And I think that those points that are made are very valid, and I want to look at how we do that too. It has just been difficult. The people who actually chair the AIGs are also head teachers in schools too. And I still think that was the right decision, because this is about people on the ground. But yeah, when we have situations like this, it makes it difficult, because all those head teachers are given a degree of time where they can come out of school and work. And I think there are elements of this that we're going to have to rethink. So that's a fair, valid point that I would want to take forward moving forward.
Okay, and there's another one here that's not unrelated to that. So, a parent saying that her son has been put forward for an alternative pathway request. He's currently in P6. Are you able to advise when I may hear the outcome of this? And also, is there an appeal process for this? I hear so many different things from other parents that it is confusing. Thank you.
Yeah. So first of all, I said at the start of this is one of the things that we're trying to change, because when you're put forward to the IG, it is about support. And so we're moving away from that notion, you're put forward for an alternative pathway. And that's a discussion that we've been having with schools as well too. In fact, at the start of term in September, I talked to head teachers about this, because in some ways that can raise expectations. And then when those expectations about, a different school or a different pathway, they're not fulfilled, and the decision of the IG is no, we don't feel that's appropriate, we feel other things may be appropriate, then that can be very difficult, and it's a difficult conversation. I do appreciate that with the school as well too, and then there can be very much disappointment in the part of the parent as well too. It's also been in terms of when might you hear. The AIG does meet every 2 months, but a lot of that is around making decisions about the cases that are sitting here. And about, when we hear in terms of a decision can also depend on what the availability, the capacities is like within the system too. And I'm trying not to say that to, put out lots of jargon there, but it just can be quite a complicated system. We would normally want to move in cases. Sometimes you can move in cases within a couple of months. Sometimes it's not appropriate to do that, and it's better for the child to wait to the appropriate transition points themselves. And sometimes that can be about movement within a receiving school, where they might have children and young people moving on too. We've had some particular difficulties this year, which I found very frustrating as well, where we might have granted a placement and a child to move on. And unfortunately, due to some difficulties around staffing and continual issues around that, we've not been able to do that. What I would say is that, one of the only things around that is these have mainly been about children who are already in specialist provision and are moving to perhaps a standalone provision. And also some of our bases and some of our standalone provisions are not hugely different in terms of the complexity of need as well. And in fact, some of our bases, the support ratios for teaching staff and support staff are just as good. In fact, in some cases, even better than at times some of the ratios in our schools. And that's one of the things that standalone schools, that's one of the things that I'm looking at just now as well too, is looking at, how we do that support within different settings. So I hate to say it because I don't really like to normally do that, but it's not an exact science. But where the decision is taken, we will always try our best to move to at a time that is appropriate for the needs of that child. But sometimes, unfortunately, it's not as quick as we might hope. And there's different reasons around that. I hope that's a fair answer. It might not necessarily be the one that people want to hear, and they might want to know more about it, but it's just, as I say, it's not always an exact science.
Okay, thanks, Jane. There's a couple of questions I think are linked, and it's all about, that front-facing information. So there's somebody asking, are there a list of the 35 co-located base schools? And then there's a comment about the confusion about why some schools call them units, some call it resources, some call it bases. So there's all these different titles. You've also got specialist autism units versus speech and language resource. Are there different kinds of units, or are they all basically just for additional support needs? And I think that is, it's on your plans, Jane, that you want to engage with parents to try and, make sure everything is understood. And I think these points, will probably resonate with you. So took those two together.
Yeah, absolutely. And that some of that information is exactly what I am seeking to improve, and that will be improved. And if I can say to you, right at the start when I talked about children with additional support needs going to schools in their local area, a primary and secondary standalone schools are known as Kirkriggs Primary, Linburn Academy, Hollybrook Academy, Cardinal Winning School. We are going to move away, see, in terms of bases also. For example, St Charles Primary and St Charles LCR. Your child goes to St Charles Primary, moving away from Altmore Park Primary and Altmore Park LCR. No, your child goes to Altmore Park Primary. They will attend a base within it, but they also have access to mainstream, so they'll be attending that primary school or that secondary if it's a base within a secondary as well too. So in actual fact, I think that those kind of definitions are not particularly helpful. So whilst I can identify where base provision will be across the city, at the same time, I actually think we should move away to, and that parents should say, my child goes to whatever school they go to, not, and they go to a base within it. No, they go to the school. So that's something that's going to be happening. And we're already working with city building around that and about signage and things like that, which sounds like a small thing, but I actually think it's a really important thing as well too. Now, there was another part of that question I'm trying to remember, Catherine. So there was about, and it was about those types of provision. And that's a really good point as well, because again, just as in we are looking at those ASL schools and they'll be known as ASL schools, not, that's a complex need, so that's an ALN, etc. No, there'll be ASL schools. Similarly, our bases, there's at times not a huge difference between what would be known as the LCR bases, which were mainly set up initially to be for children with an autistic profile who also for P1 to P3, and then they'd be fully integrated into mainstream. But then, that was just not always appropriate to do that in that timescale as well. And sometimes developmentally, sometimes it was around P3, P4, where some schools began to have some concerns about provision for a child, and they might then move at that point. So we try not to be definitive about that. But sometimes in our what are known as ALM bases in primary, the majority of the children and young people in there have a profile of autism as their key additional support need, and may have others additional support needs too. So there's a great deal of similarities. And I think in terms of autism, that is certainly one of the key areas in terms of training for staff that we are absolutely prioritising. And I remember when we did that within my own school too, and a lot of the learning from that doesn't just benefit those children and young people who may be identified as having that additional specific support need, but it actually benefits large numbers of children and young people who might not be known to have that profile, and it really helps them. It's similar in terms of often the approach in terms of supporting learners who have English as an additional language. It often doesn't just benefit those learners, it benefits many, many more learners too. I hope that answers the question. And again, I've written that down as well. So as you can see, my Easter was already busy and my summer's going to be very busy too.
Okay, next one, slightly different. I know how difficult things have been for schools during COVID. However, kids with more complex needs have missed out on a lot, such as outings and access to the hydro pool. When will kids be able to get back in the pool and out of school? Other councils have resumed already.
Yes, this is somebody who's been reading my mind as well too. I'm already asking questions about our hydro pools, and I was speaking to a health and safety colleague only last week about that. So I'm very hopeful that there will be movement on that very soon. And I would certainly say, I'll probably get into trouble for saying that. So long as nobody says anything, I'm hoping that will be after Easter. And certainly in terms of outings, I know that many schools have now started outings. And I mean, I know that my colleagues across schools, not just ASL schools, but mainstream too, are keen to begin to get up and running again. We have had Blair Vaddock trips going out too, our outdoor centre. So I know that schools are looking at that and really want to get back to some sense of normality, but particularly for our young people, our children, young people in our ASL schools, those experiences, those enriching experiences are absolutely vital. And I do appreciate that for a number of carers, parents and carers, it can be really difficult going in outings at weekends with your child. And I love how schools really try to engage you in many of these outings and activities too. Some of it has been about some of our in-school activities. As you know, schools have been open as much as possible throughout the past 2 years, but some of the providers we work with, unfortunately, have been working from home or online, etc., which just doesn't meet our needs at all. And so that's been quite difficult, watching relationships that have been built up over many years, unfortunately, not being able to go forward. But I know from speaking to all my colleagues, they are very, very keen to do that. One of the things I should have mentioned in my learning from the pandemic that I'd forgotten about was the great growth in terms of outdoor learning. One of the real pleasures of my job over the past 2 years is kind of signing off money for schools, for ASL schools in particular, and for some of my bases as well, to enhance their outdoor learning provision and make sure that our children and young people have many more opportunities for good quality outdoor learning too. So that has been a bonus. But yep, I've written that one down, and I'll go and see my colleague again tomorrow and say, come on, I've been asked by parents this question, because I mean, it just is such a great experience where there are hydro pools in schools. Being able to access those, it really is fantastic. So I will go on to that first thing tomorrow, and with all the guidance changing as well, again, I know the masks have come back a bit, and obviously there's concerns about case levels, but we would really want to get things moving much, much more in that area.
Okay. Something different again, Jean, and this is about movement across local authorities. So what are the implications if a child moves local authority, either after they've been placed in an ASN school or midway through the process? Is there continuity between councils, or does the process have to start again?
Now, this was part of my steep learning curve as well when I joined. If a child is in an ASL school, for example, say in Glasgow, and perhaps they move to South Lanarkshire, nobody is going to turn around and say, well, from Monday, sorry, but you can't come any longer. That just would not happen. So what we do is I have relationships with all my colleagues in surrounding local authorities, and we tend to get in touch with each other and say, need to make you aware that this child has moved, and it then means that they become responsible in terms of that placement cost, but also in terms of transport as well. But we always try our best to act in the interest of the child and link in with the parents as well too. And it may be that for a period of time, the best thing to do is for that a child or young person to remain in whatever the local authority they were in, whatever that provision is. And then we look to do that planned transition to another authority. So that tends to be, but sometimes sometimes there can be issues in and amongst that. Sometimes there can be issues about capacities that the other authority might have, and it can be about capacity. So, I mean, the amount of places that we might have as well too. So sometimes, we might say, well, actually, we were hoping to move after Christmas, but could the child stay there for a longer period of time? If that's, we have a discussion with parents about that too, because I mentioned right at the start about travelling, although sometimes I get told by parents a child really enjoys actually the travel aspect and being the taxi or being the bus, etc. But more often than not, we try to look at a solution, but we do that solution at, I'll certainly say to my head teachers, can you speak to your parent? Can you ask, what would be their preference, etc. It can become a bit more complex if that move to another local authority is going to be much longer term, and the parent says, no, but I still want them to remain in that school indefinitely or for the foreseeable future. That it can get a bit more complex then, but we always try to look at, what might be the best solution and try to think of the needs of that child as well.
Okay. The next one, my son is in P6 mainstream in the South Side. Over a month ago, the school told us that they've applied for an ALN school to meet the needs of my son, and we agreed. How and when can we get an update about this alternative pathway? And I suspect that this just relates to the timing of meetings, and that keeping in touch with the school is the best way, but you may have a different response to that, Jean. So I don't want to assume that I've got the answers when you're the expert.
Well, there's a couple of things in that. And again, the school agreed to put in, and as I said before, the area inclusion groups are about support. They are not about we put in for a placement. And so that's something I would want to take up with the school that had said that as well, that it is actually about a referral on the basis of support as well too. And it may be that what we look at is how do we ensure that that child actually stays with their peers within their community, within that mainstream setting. Are there other things that we can do? However, we also have particular cut-off dates around schools referring for support to the AIG, particularly when they are suggesting that might be support for potentially a different pathway, a different school, etc. And that was mid-January. And there's a good reason for that. And that's because we're trying to get transitions going. We are trying to ensure that we can get decisions out to parents. And I can get a wee bit frustrated when we get, late referrals that are coming in. And we've had quite a number of those from the different parts of the city too, because as I said to you, we are child-centred and needs-led, and we have to look at these cases, but it then might impact on other placement decisions that we're making. So it's really, really difficult. So at some point it will be looked at, but it's really important that, what we have just now, that parents are informed in terms of those decisions that were made at the end of January. And, one of the things that, my inbox is full of is I haven't heard a decision yet. And we've been trying to ensure that those decisions go out to those parents where schools have put in referrals pre-January, which is what we had asked. And we're trying to ensure that we're getting better every year at getting earlier and earlier. So, for example, this year I had said we should prioritise also those children who are presently in ASL schools so that their parents know where that enhanced transition is to. And then we look at the cases that are coming from mainstream, because, there is an argument if a child has been in a mainstream school for, throughout right up to P6 or P7, that what we would want to look at is to see how we would maintain that support into a mainstream secondary moving forward. And I do, understand that parents get concerned because some secondaries are really big and they're really concerned about their child in that kind of bigger environment. Will they get lost? I don't mean lost in the school, but, as a young person, their needs, how would their needs be met? But, I would say to you as somebody who worked in a secondary as well, that, we had lots of different levels of provision, lots of safe space provision, lots of people who were more specialised in areas as well too. And, taking that nurturing approach as well, that made quite a significant difference. And I had a high percentage of young people as well with that profile that included autism. And we had specific ongoing pieces of work around that, particularly about staff training too. And we're very focused on ensuring that, all of those young people went on to a positive sustained destination so that they would never be lost in the system as well too. So, yeah, and that would be the answer. But
okay.
any case that comes into the IG will be looked at some point. But I think it is like everything else, you need to have timescales, otherwise if we just, let things go on and on and on over the months, then that would be unfair to the majority that do put in referrals prior to the deadlines that we set.
Okay. Question here, if a parent feels that a placement request in another mainstream school would be the best option for an autistic child other than their catchment school, would transport be available to support that request?
For a placement request, transport is not normally available. That is the stock answer in terms of placement request. When you make a placement request, transport is not normally available.
Okay, moving on, because I'm conscious of time. I think we've gone over and the questions keep coming, so I'd maybe say, maybe no more questions coming on, or we could be here till midnight.
Well, I hate to tell you, I'm a parent as well too, and I need to pick my wee girl
I know,
up.
so I think we, somebody here, and I can probably answer this. My son is in P6 and I'm wondering who's the best contact to discuss his transition to secondary. The deputy head just says the feeder school is good. I know it is, as I have older children who attend, but I'm not convinced that this is the best option for my son. My response to that would be that, ask for a more in-depth discussion with the school to discuss, your thoughts about it and what support is available for the transition. But you might, you're the expert, Jean, so I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, Catherine, I agree with that. And also, contact your local secondary as well and say to them, is there any way that, could I come from a visit if you still don't feel that, that you're getting that opportunity? I think most schools would have enhanced transition opportunities in P6. The pandemic might have got a wee bit in the way of that, but certainly that would often be the case. And certainly a lot of secondary have open evenings. I know we did that, we're open to P6 and P7 as well. So we just didn't prioritise P7. But of course, a lot of them might not have been happening, unfortunately, and it's all virtual tours and things like that too. But, you can approach them as well if you want to do that. Okay,
sorry, I was on mute. I thought I'd taken myself off mute and I hadn't. We've got a couple, a comment about the, schools having to make the difficult decision to close early on a few occasions over the last year due to COVID and staff isolating. Can additional support be given to schools to try and avoid early closures, as this can cause great disruption to kids and be very hard for working parents? And, I think you've touched on that, Jean. And then there's another comment. I'm trying to take two together here because they're on the same theme. My grandson's school's one of the schools where 2 and 3 classes have had to stay off through staff shortage. They do the best they can, but also there are problems with transport because when there's a bus driver off, they don't have staff to cover. And, although they're asking for help, they can't offer any more taxis. It causes a lot of stress and meltdown for kids, for parents, for carers who are waiting on the bus in the morning and then they don't turn up at the last minute. Parents don't have a lot of notice, so there's impact on people going to work. Could an alternative driver not be set up to cover driver absence to stop the disruption to kids' educations and routines? And I think, there are the challenges here of lots of staff off with COVID and not having staff in the system. And I know that my own schools are really affected and there are no additional staff to draw on. And I know you've touched on this already, Jean, but is there anything else that you want to add as a comment to that?
What I will add to you is that I'm writing down a lot of these comments just now, in fact, all of them. And I will raise that with my director tomorrow, Douglas Hutchinson. I will be circumspect in what I say here, but it is very difficult in terms of transport and very frustrating as well to the present circumstances, COVID, but also when drivers, they are entitled obviously to go on holiday. And often when that happens, we do have backup drivers, but the backup drivers are now all being used as well. Some of that's around long-term absences too, and the taxi situation has been particularly difficult as well for reasons that everyone listening in tonight will, I'm sure, be aware of in terms of taxi driver numbers, etc. too. So it has been very, very challenging in terms of transport and frustrating. And I absolutely get that and sympathise with people, which is not much help when you are the person that's standing waiting in a bus or a taxi to arrive with your child and they don't. But I can assure you that I will take that issue forward, and I have been taking that issue forward on a number of occasions. And just to say, you know, we have staff who work in that division who do try extremely hard to make sure that there continues to be provision, but it is very difficult for them as well too. But I have written that down as well as all the other points, and I will be raising them, and we are going to be meeting and having a look at all that provision, but it's just hugely difficult just now. Another hugely difficult.
Yeah. I think some of it's, you know, taxis. I know that when my kids have been out in town, you worry about them getting home now because there's so few taxis on the road. I think one of the taxi companies my daughter had booked with, they called and said, no taxi, we've got 2 cars on the road tonight. And that was a company that would previously have had, you know, endless drivers out there on the road. So people left that profession during COVID. And, you know, we're also experiencing the fallout from that in schools.
And I was just going to add, Catherine, you saw at the start in the presentation about those rising numbers. So it's rising numbers, most of whom will be entitled to transport provision at a time when that transport provision is really difficult as well. So, but it is something that we're looking at.
Hopefully things will ease through time, but you know, there are no immediate solutions, so everybody's doing their best. Couple of questions here just to finish off. I think one's more a comment, but one here asking for a bit of myth busting. Do schools receive extra money when a child is receiving DLA or CDP?
That's a really good question. I don't know the answer to that one, so I'm writing that down and I'll take that away. You know, I mean, I'm sure everybody knows about the Pupil Equity Fund, but the Pupil Equity Fund is determined by the numbers of children, young people whose families are living in socioeconomic areas. But no, and what we try to do as well is we try to give a weighting to schools where there are particular needs as well. And if a child has specific disabilities that need an enhancement, then again we try to give some additionality to schools to help with that too.
Okay.
My husband's just come into the room and he's pointing his watch to say.
Oh, final. Can we give you the final one then? And I think you've probably touched on a lot of this before, and it's back to AIG process. So my little one got taken to AIG. We received a letter saying she should go to mainstream school. No feedback given. Is there a review process in place that will help ensure she has the best support? Right now, she'll be in a class with 23 children, 1 teacher and 1 assistant for the whole class.
Yeah. And again, in those cases, one of the things that we are going to do next term is look at where some of our additionality is, because I've actually got some enhancement for that. So it might be that child in that school that we're looking at that. In terms of the review, what we've said to parents is there's another process, which is the placing request process. And if a placing request is put in, that will be looked at by other people as well. So it acts as our review process. And sometimes we also, for different reasons, go back and just revisit in terms of our moderation as well. But certainly the placing request process can be used as well. And I'll make sure that when we're changing that information online, that we'll put that in. But as I say to you, you know, what we do is, as well as, you know, the AIG looking at, you know, the supports that it has recommended, including the pathways, we are looking closely at how we then track those children and young people whose decision was not to move to that setting, and you know, we're getting better at that. I feel about looking at the resources and how we might resource that as well too. Okay, and it all just goes back to that point I said in the presentation about trying to take that child-centred approach and always trying to think about what would be in the best long-term interests as well too. And it's not easy, and at times we don't always get it right, but it's really important that we reflect on that and that we're able to revisit it, and we don't become, I would hate to think that, you know, I was heard of an organisation that became intransigent or inflexible. It's really important to look at that. But I do appreciate, you know, the worry that parents can have that decision doesn't go the way they might feel that they had wanted, but we will absolutely work with that child to try and get the very best outcomes wherever it is that educational setting is.
Okay.